I just want to offer a couple of facts. I mean, obviously, guns are a hot topic across the nation and in Oklahoma. And there are a few facts. Oklahoma is a very gun-friendly state in terms of restrictions. We've seen changes in laws in recent years. In fact, the Washington Post did a review of all 50 states and looked at 7 types of gun restrictions and found that Oklahoma had one, a prohibition on high-risk individuals owning firearms. For example, those convicted of felonies and those with mental illness. At the same time, we have some of the highest firearm death rates in the nation. In 2014, 15, 16, we were among the top 10 worst in firearm deaths, 5th highest in 2016, with 766 deaths. Many of those are suicides, but also a number of homicides. But let's be clear, mass shootings account for a tiny fraction of gun deaths, and we haven't had a very severe mass shooting since 1986 at the Edmond post office. They define mass shootings, if you define it as 4 or more victims, then we've had some of those. I don't know the count, but certainly it's an issue. I'd like to start off with Ms. Stone. More than a decade ago, the U.S. Supreme Court was clear in its ruling. Individuals in the country have a right to keep and bear arms under the Second Amendment. It's been decided. A Pew Trust poll shows that most people believe owning a gun makes people safer. And finally, I should just point out the irony of the question of guns in America, and that is over the last 25 years, violent deaths in the country have declined by nearly 50%, and no one can really explain why that's happened. So my question for you would be, why do you think more gun restrictions are needed?
So I think any loss of life is certainly something that we should consider. And so it's, we're looking at this individual right to own a gun. So it's fine if you want to take the Second Amendment and look at it in a bubble, but we need to look at the Second Amendment in the context of other amendments, public safety issues, and the way our society treats each other. So as we look at this, you say there's a decrease in violent crime, but actually, as we look at gun deaths, those are on the rise. In the last 5 years, we've seen that number tick up, and of course, we can't say that the cause is looser gun laws, but potentially that's a challenge. We also have a lot of other, anger issues and other issues in our country. And the fact is, you talk about the Pew study about how people think that owning a gun makes them safer. And while that may be the public opinion, whenever we look at statistics, owning a gun does not make you safer. In fact, there's risks to owning a gun. And just bringing a gun into a domestic violence situation, for example, makes it 5 times more likely that someone will die. So I think that we need to educate the public, and that's why I'm glad that we're having this discussion tonight. Thank you, Oklahoma Watch, and thank you, David, for moderating, and I look forward to continuing this discussion.
Thank you. Mr. Spencer, the Supreme Court ruling explicitly says the Second Amendment is not isn't unlimited. You can ban possession by some people. You can limit carrying guns in sensitive places. Polls show most people favor more restrictions like universal mandatory background checks, a ban on assault rifles. Why do you think fewer gun restrictions are needed?
Because fewer gun restrictions lowers the crime rate. It's quite consistent. And in that analogy of that, I find it amazing too that they say fewer guns lowers the crime, or is the problem. I'm sorry, more guns is the problem. But in my own personal life, not once but twice, I pulled a firearm for the act of self-defense and did not have to squeeze the trigger, thank God, and it thwarted the crime. So these are all things that go on too that are not recorded. The NRA has a stat on it, which is really high, which I don't know if I believe it. They say there's some 2 million a year thwarted crimes because of the peaceful possession of a firearm. So I just know in my own personal life, I have successfully been able to defend myself, and that a firearm definitely made it safer in my wife's life when she was attacked on her own front yard by 5 perpetrators, and she ended up in the emergency room that night. So I know that because she pulled her firearm and got a shot off, and the perpetrators left. So I know that it works, and this happened just last June. So I know the peaceful possession of a firearm will thwart a crime because a criminal will go find a softer target as a result of it.
I'd like to follow up and ask, we've had a relaxation of gun restrictions in Oklahoma in recent years.
You're welcome.
I was going to ask if you were involved in all that, but I won't even. I guess my question is, what else would you like to see changed in terms of gun laws?
Well, just and that relaxation, before 2010, and OK2A came into effect in 2009, but before that, Oklahoma was in the bottom third of liberty on firearms, and that was because people don't even realize it, and still today, this is still the law today, and it changes November 1st. But if you purchased a firearm, you take it home, and you want to walk across the street and show your neighbor your brand new shotgun, even if it's still in a box, it's a misdemeanor crime. And it has been since 1907. So since 2009, OK2A, we've had the repeal of 9 felonies for the peaceful possession of a firearm, which is just absolutely ludicrous that a person couldn't leave their gun in the car whether they're at a VOTEC. It used to be a felony. They couldn't leave their gun in the car whether they're at a public or private school. It used to be a felony. A teacher couldn't carry a gun in a school, in a public or private. We've got those repealed. Carrying on a bus that you owned on your own private property used to be a felony. And these are some of the ones, and then this last year we've got another one repealed this year, so a person can have what is called a Shockwave or a TAC-14 shotgun. It's been repealed. The governor just signed it. So to what more could we do? I think we need to get rid of the no-gun zones as much as possible. And as far as I didn't quite answer your question earlier, yes, there are limitations on the Second Amendment. I agree, prisoners should not have guns.
Okay. That's it?
Pretty close.
Okay.
Pretty close. You can throw something else at me, but I think that's pretty
Okay.
close to it.
Okay. Ms. Stone, what would you like to see changed?
I definitely think people other than just prisoners probably ought to not have guns.
And I should mention 2 or 3 things, say, that you would like to see changed.
2 or 3 things. Well, I think, Mr. Spencer is talking about how his personal experience informs his gun, his sense of what gun rights should be. I think you can't go by personal experience. You have to listen to public health authorities, doctors, studies, science. My brother-in-law, literally 2 weeks ago, was held up at his car with a guy who had a gun. He was able to disarm the guy and defuse the situation using his power cord to his computer. So in reality, we probably don't need to have the number of guns that Mr. Spencer believes we do. And I think that as we... So, I think the idea that we don't want to limit guns, we don't want to look at people who potentially have felonies, violent felonies, a history of domestic abuse, people whose family members believe they should not have guns, people whose psychiatric doctors believe they should not have guns. There's many categories of people who should simply not have access to guns, at least at that personal point in their lives. And to just say that anyone but prisoners should have guns is a really extreme position that is completely out of step with what most Americans believe. And so I think that, some specific things that Moms Demand Action would like to see, and really I think none of these things would probably limit anyone in this room's ability to have a gun and to keep the guns that they have. So universal background checks. Right now, 80% of guns have a background check, 20% don't. We'd like to see extreme risk protective orders become the law in the state of Oklahoma, as they are in 15 other states and the District of Columbia. We'd also like to disarm domestic abusers, because that is one of the ways that women are dying in our state.
Thank you. I'd like to touch on a few more recent issues. In Oklahoma, of course, now we have constitutional carry, which will take effect November 1st, if I'm correct. And that means anyone 21 or over can carry a firearm without training or the licensing. And I should point out now, nearly 300,000 Oklahomans have a handgun license in the state. Mr. Spencer, why do you view this as necessary? Critics would say this is like the Old West. You can just carry a gun anywhere. And maybe you can also clarify exactly what open carry is.
Oh, great. Yes, I got a little bit of an idea. Appreciate that. In 1996, when concealed carry came into existence because of the Edmond shooting and also the Sirloin State Court murders in 1978, I believe it was, and they said enough was enough. And so the legislature put through concealed carry and made it pretty tough, really, to get it. And so, but at the time, the pushback on it was common sense that people should not be able to carry a gun. And so, and law enforcement a lot didn't like it because they just weren't used to it in the culture. And so then came along 2012, open carry came along. And the pushback, well, it's common sense that people just shouldn't be able to open carry because everyone can see the gun. And so it was passed, and we've all adapted to that in the culture. And so constitutional carry has come along now, and I don't see what it'll be any different because people say it's common sense that the people shouldn't be able to exercise their right when the fact is they have the right to do so. So I don't anticipate... I think you'll see some enthusiasm for long gun carry and stuff that you may not have ever seen before in this state at first, but I think guys will get lazy eventually and just say, I'll just go back and carry my gun in my holster, which is easier. I think you'll eventually see that. So I don't anticipate a big, huge problem with it. 14 other states, we're 15, number 15, there's 16 states that have it. They're adapting to it. But the thing in this state is it's just not been in our culture. You go to a state that has this and has had it for a long time, someone walking down the street with a firearm doesn't get a second look because they're peaceful and it's just not an issue.
Well, let me ask you real quick. Does open carry mean I can stick a gun in the back pocket of my jeans and walk around with it?
Open carry means that any portion of the firearm is visible. Concealed carry is that there is no portion of the firearm is visible.
But does the gun have to be in a holster or
if you're carrying it, that is correct. You cannot carry a firearm in your hands. So let's make that perfectly clear. So it has to be either in a sling, holster, scabbard, or a case to carry the firearm.
Thanks. I'd like to ask just the audience if they could let the guests answer the questions so we can get it recorded and presented to all the public, not to interject during their answers. Normal reactions are fine. Just please be respectful of that. Ms. Stone, open carry, constitutional carry, people say they want to be safe. They need to be armed to feel safe and for self-defense. Why would you oppose open carry or constitutional carry? I'm assuming you do.
Yeah, I do. I think, we were very disheartened to see this. We prefer to call it permitless carry. When permitless carry passed, I think it was very disappointing because it wasn't a legislative win or loss. It meant that real Oklahomans are likely to die based on the experience in other states. So I'm never going to get used to somebody carrying an AR-15 in a park. I don't think that is something that most people are ever going to get comfortable with. I don't know you if you have an AR-15. And so the idea that people are going to be able to carry these long guns through public spaces should concern everyone. Whether people decide to take advantage of it or not, if they decide a pistol is more comfortable or whatever, they still have the law says they can do that. And we see states like Alaska, which they enacted their permitless carry in 2001, and in 2017, assaults were up with a gun by 82%. We see Arizona with a similar increase in a 7-year period. They had a 39% increase. In St. Louis, which this is really concerning because in metropolitan areas, I think is where you're going to see some of the worst outcomes. And in St. Louis, it went into effect January 1, and they had a 25% increase in assaults over that year. So to say this doesn't matter or people just need to get used to it, that belies the fact that there is true evidence that our FBI stats and our state and local and city stats tell us this is not what we want as a society. We don't want to get used to more violence.
David, I reject the Bloomberg stats. They're completely designed to be one-sided. If you go and look at how this bill took about, it came out of the first committee 9-2. That's over 85%. It comes out of the House floor 70-30. That's 70%. It goes out of the Senate committee 18-4. That's almost 90%. And then it comes off of the Senate floor with nearly 90%. Those people are representing their districts, and that's exactly what was consistent with.
I'd like to respond to that.
Quickly.
So what we see is that 85% of Oklahomans are not in favor of permitless carry. And even some people here tonight are surprised to hear that people can carry an AR-15 through the park as a result of this law. So I think that there was probably not enough education done. And additionally, our reps have Mr. Spencer visiting them every single day at the Capitol. And he says these are Bloomberg stats. They aren't Bloomberg stats. This is from the St. Louis Police Department, the Arizona authorities. This is from government statistics. It's not Bloomberg stats. These are real crime stats from law enforcement that I'm sharing with you. I don't need to pad the stats.
Well, it's good to know, David, too. We protect Moms Demand Action's First Amendment right, and why you would have a problem with me being in the state capitol representing myself, I have no idea that would be an issue. But it was us, OK2A, that protected Moms Demand Action, your First Amendment right, in January, when the Ethics Commission tried to make every one of us a lobbyist before we could walk in that door. It was yesterday we got passed off the floor and helped with Senate Bill 361, so a free speech is protected on a college campus.
Thank you.
I didn't see any other red shirts up there help defending those other rights either. It was OK2A.
I'd like to move on to one other current issue, and that is there is a Senate bill in the legislature right now that would reduce the training requirements for teachers and other school employees, I assume, to carry firearms in schools. Mr. Spencer, why do you think that's important? I mean, and keep in mind, of course, we've had horrific mass shootings in Connecticut, in Parkland, Florida, in Connecticut, 20 children killed. It's perceived as a very sensitive area of innocence. So why do you think teachers need to be armed?
Well, it wasn't teachers that shot those students, for starters. Let's make that clear. In 2013, OK2A, and I wrote the bill for it to make sure private schools could have teachers armed in their schools, because that was, at the time, it was a felony. That's been 6 years ago. Have you heard any problems in this state? No, because the peaceful possession of a firearm can thwart a crime, just like I've stated. And again, you're going to see the same thing. OK2A pays for the signs that go out inside of schools that says, our students are armed. If you enter this to harm anybody, you will be met with deadly force. And instead of having a gun, instead of the sign up there that says it's a no-gun zone, which basically is come in and do what you want until the law enforcement can show up. We are proactive on this, and being proactive is going to be an aggressive effort to make sure that at least the bad guy knows if he's going to make that crazy, insane effort, he's going to be met with some type of force.
Ms. Stone, what is your thought on this proposal?
Well, first, you talk about being proactive. We're all about being proactive. At the point that somebody is in a school shooting a gun, that's been a failure. It's a failure to have extreme risk protective orders. It's a failure of law enforcement. It's a failure of our systems to work. It's a failure sometimes of the mental health system. So there's been many failures that lead up to any kind of situation where we would need to protect students in a school. Fundamentally, when teachers have guns in schools, things that are bad will happen. And what we see is trained law enforcement professionals who have way more training, especially if we get rid of the training that Mr. Spencer would like to get rid of. We see that these trained law enforcement professionals have accidental discharges of guns. They leave their guns in the bathroom by accident. In fact, in Minnesota, a third grader was able to get the trigger of a law enforcement officer's gun. He had it in the holster, and there was an accidental discharge in a classroom with third grade students. And so when we talk about having teachers doing all the other things they do, they don't need to be armed security as well. And they certainly don't need to have training requirements lifted.
Thank you.
Can I clarify the bill too, if you mind? For starters, the bill is nothing takes place without the school board's authority. So the school board has to make it okay. And then they also say which teachers can carry and obviously which ones cannot. So if this passes the school board, they can do nothing and then nothing changes. They can have the same. So if they've got resource officers or if they've got nothing, nothing changes.
Okay, thanks. Let's open it up to questions from the audience. We have, Vivian over here, and Sophie also has a mic. So if you'll raise your hand, they'll come to you, and we'll take questions. Please keep your questions to about 30 minutes. You can express your viewpoints. We don't really have time to go into a long questions that are really statements. So, you're right there.
And I'll be holding the microphone.
Oh, okay. I'm an Army vet. I have a concealed carry license and I own a gun. I'm also a member of Moms Demand Action. I am just mystified why you think it's, Mr. Spencer, why you think it's okay to have carry a gun without a permit and without any kind of training. I have a brother who does not have a permit and is very happy he can now get a gun without one. And I started quizzing him on what he thought the law was about when he could shoot and what make my day was and everything. And he was completely wrong, and it scared the hell out of me. So why don't you want people to have training to carry a gun?
No one ever said anything that we don't want people to be trained to carry a gun. That's never been stated. That has never been stated and never will be. I'm a CLEAT certified firearm instructor and licensed security officer. I train people. So they're not a victim, so they can be a survivor. So, ma'am, if a person can go purchase a firearm today and today right now and own it, they can carry it in their home. But yes, as far as training, we highly recommend people get more training up to the level you feel comfortable with. And
Now they don't have to.
yes, ma'am, rights come with responsibilities.
Okay, thank you. We have another question right here in front.
Ms. Stone, did you grow up with pistols in your house?
Yeah, I did. I mean, my father always had a gun in the house. We currently have guns in our home. I've shot an AR-15. I respect the right for people to own guns. I understand, despite the statistics, it does make people feel safer. And so I think that's a personal choice if you want to have it in your home. But whenever your right crosses over into impinging someone else's, at that point, it's prudent for government to issue regulations to make sure that everybody gets to exercise their rights in America.
We'll take another question in the back. In the hat.
Can't see you.
Speak into the microphone, please.
Hi, I'm Belinda Barker. I'm a former deputy out of Cleveland County, first woman to run for sheriff in this state in '96. I worked about 2 miles from here at a park called Menace Lakeview, which in the '90s was the worst gang you could get into. Spring Lake Division would not even respond to that area unless there was 2 or more units. I held that park. Now, what would you tell women over there as far as being able to protect themselves? Second, you made the comment that
Question,
Mr. Spencer's up at the Capitol a lot. Well, I'm up there a lot too. I have video footage that you're more than welcome to of Moms Demand Action standing on the side saying if we see anybody carrying, we are going to call the police. And I've seen, like at the Edmond deal last week, we had the same thing. But what are you going to do to tell these women that are in these impoverished areas? How should they protect themselves? Grab the steak knife?
Well, thank you. You had one question initially that was about the park. Mr. Spencer, I assume that was directed at you. Do you want to answer?
I work diligently to make sure women aren't victims. If whatever it takes for them to defend themselves they're comfortable with is absolutely their right to use. Self-preservation is God ordained.
I mean, I think, so anytime there's a situation with a woman and a man and a gun, there's inherent danger. And 90% of the women that are killed by guns in the entire developed world are from America. So when we talk about protecting women, we are not talking about more guns.
That's weird because I was with my wife in the front yard target shooting last week, and we're both still alive and doing quite well, thank you.
I'll use this opportunity real quickly to bring up the Violence Against Women Act, which is before Congress. Of course, as you may know, the House passed a bill that would close the so-called boyfriend loophole, which I think under federal law now, those convicted of domestic abuse can lose their guns if married to a victim, have a child together, or a parent or guardian. The new law would extend that to stalkers and current or former dating partners. Mr. Spencer, what do you think of that proposal?
I think we already have that in this bill, in the constitutional carry bill. If you want, I can look through here and find it for you in just a moment.
For boyfriends who are living with a victim?
I doubt that's in here, but what we did was in this bill, we copied the federal law at the time and put it in here. So a person that's been convicted of domestic violence, a felon or whatever, cannot, if you have to legally be able to purchase a firearm before you can carry it. That's the easiest way to put it. So if you can't legally purchase it, because you've got a VPO against you or whatever, you cannot carry the gun.
Boy, I am glad to hear that Mr. Spencer is in favor of the boyfriend loophole, everybody. I would encourage him and all the OK2A folks to give Senators Inhofe and Lankford a call tomorrow and get them on that bill.
Well, for starters, I never said I was in favor of it. never in favor of anything that I haven't read yet. So I wait to read it. Some of us actually read bills, folks. So I would read it before I went off that. But like say, under current law, we just mirrored the federal law.
And the federal law is missing the boyfriend loophole.
Okay, thank you. Let's take another question. This gentleman, second row.
I wanted to address the representative from Moms Demand Action. We met at the Capitol for the March for Our Lives event, and I asked you why you didn't ever include any of these regulations towards law enforcement, considering there are so many minorities that are shot. You said that you didn't think that AR-15s were a useful weapon of self-defense, but you thought that police officers should have them. And I asked you why, and during that time period, you stated that sometimes law enforcement needs to be able to kill as many people as possible as quickly as possible.
Yes.
Why is it okay for law enforcement to go on a mass murdering spree?
So you've taken that comment out of context many times, and I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to correct you. The context was talking about if there was a terrorist attack, if there was a terrorist attack, we were standing at the Capitol, I said if armed terrorists stormed the Capitol, there were about 8 or so police present. I said they would need firepower to be able to overcome a group of armed terrorists. So yes, in certain situations, law enforcement do need to have advanced capabilities to be able to protect people.
I have a better
Absolutely.
solution. Excuse me. I have a better solution, is that every person in the Capitol who can legally be in possession of a firearm should be carrying and screw the terrorists when they come in.
That would be quite the scene. Everyone with guns shooting at each other at the Capitol. Can we just envision what that'll look like on the national media?
Yeah, it couldn't-
Welcome to the Wild West.
It couldn't look any worse than what the terrorists have done recently, so I can't imagine, but I assure you at least they would be stopped.
Let's take another question. This woman in the fourth row.
Hello, I'm 15 years old. I am a student of Edmond, Santa Fe. This question.
I don't see this person. Where is this person? Oh, there you are.
right
I'm sorry.
here.
Okay.
The tall redhead. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, there you go.
Yeah, I'm a 15-year-old and I attend Santa Fe High School in Edmond. And I'd just like to ask you, do you understand what it's like to be a 15-year-old going to high school in this time? Do you understand the fear that I have walking in to a high school every day, thinking I might have to go into a janitor's closet and text my mom that I love her because one of my classmates has access to an AR-15? Do you understand the fear that occurs within my adolescent body whenever I can think there are enough guns on the street currently where it's not that uncommon for me to
Thank you.
possibly
Is that
be
for me?
able to be killed.
Yeah, I think that's
for me.
for Mr. Spencer.
Okay, I would agree. High school has changed quite a bit since I was in high school, where I kept a 12-gauge shotgun in the back of my truck. We would go hunting before and after school. We never did anything terrible to any people. The problem is the culture. The problem is that you've literally taken a vacuum of good, taken God out of the schools, and all of these things, and this is the vacuum that's been filled with it. Ma'am, it's a cultural issue. It's a heart issue. You need to, instead of worry about the gun, let's worry about the heart, because that's what'll stop this in this.
So I'd like to address that. So what we see is that for some reason, the United States culture has more violence. We have more school shootings. We have children that are afraid in school. Are we more violent than other places around the world, or is it just that we have easy access to guns?
Okay, thank you. Let's take a question on this side. Sophie, if you could come toward this side.
Hi, good afternoon, or good evening. Thank you for hosting this event. I think it's very important to... Pardon?
Speak in the microphone. Okay.
Hi.
What's your question?
I'm shy.
That's all right.
I feel that President Trump has exacerbated this and has stirred this up. He, when he was running for president, said that he could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue in New York City and kill someone and no one would do it.
What's
He
your
has
question?
given free license to this. When President Obama, our revered and beloved President
Can you
Obama...
tell, what would be your question, ma'am?
I am getting to my
Okay.
question. Well, because when President Obama was elected, there was an exponential rise in the purchase of all kinds of guns. And now with the election of President Trump, it has gone down, I understand, and the NRA is in
I would like a
is in
question out of this
trouble.
too, please.
So
Thank
could
you.
you
Let me
address that?
interpret there. I think the question would be, I'll put it to Mr. Spencer first. Thank you, ma'am. Would be, under different administrations and different periods, I would say there's a use of language on both sides that the other side's question. So let's take for proponents of gun rights, there are references to, right now I'm reading about the disarmament primaries, suggesting that every Democrat, for example, wants to disarm every citizen in the country, or that federal officials might show up at the front door and seize your weapons just indiscriminately. Is there some exaggeration to prey on people's fears?
We've got Democrats that vote for our bills. I wouldn't trade them for nothing. Senator Dossett of Oklahoma, absolutely. He's a Democrat out of Owassa. He is a armed services and he's great. And we've got Republicans. I would trade him for a minute. So I think. Ma'am, if you don't like President Trump, he's done more against Second Amendment rights than Obama ever did. If you look at the statistics on what he's done on the bump stock ban, that is absolutely crazy that he would do that. I have a problem with President Trump because of that specific thing. Obama never got a single gun bill taken away. He threatened it, but he never did it. So if you look at that, the bottom line.
Ms. Stone, what do you think? Do you think?
I'll be honest, I don't agree with President Trump on much, but he did ban bump stocks. This is something that Mr. Spencer has been openly defiant of, skirting federal law, as a matter of fact. So when we talk about the culture, I believe the culture should be following the law. And also, President Trump has also said that he would think about expanding background checks, increasing age limits for certain gun purchases. He supported a high-capacity magazine ban. So I think, we can look at the research, no matter if you like Trump or not, we can look at the research and come to good conclusions if we all look at valid research. And even if we disagree on other things, we can come to reasonable gun sense laws.
Thank you. There's a gentleman in the middle there in the plaid shirt who had a question.
Yes, this is a follow-up to this brave young woman's question. That's not easy to do, sister. I'm a high school U.S. history teacher, and every time there's a mass shooting at a school, I always have a conversation with them. How do you feel? Because I tell them, look, they're interviewing adults all over TV, but you never see them interview kids until Parkland. That made all the difference. So my question is to each of the representatives, what has your organization been doing to speak to the students of Oklahoma about gun violence in schools?
Ms. Stone, what is your group doing?
So Moms Demand Action, we didn't organize the March for Our Lives, but we had a really strong presence there, and we absolutely support those students. And they've been leading that movement and have not needed adults to tell them what to do, but we have certainly advised them. Secondly, we have Students Demand Action. That is a group of students, and so students can have chapters in their schools and all across the state. We are bringing those chapters right now. That's been something within the last year that Moms Demand Action has kind of branched into. So we're creating student groups right now in Edmond, in Norman, at OU, at O-Tri-C. All those groups are being put together right now. And I think it's important that we, that we give students a proactive way to begin to address these fears that they have. So mass shootings are rare, and they happen in schools fairly infrequently, but we have to recognize the psychic harm that we're causing our students. And students need outlets like Students Demand Action to be able to be empowered and to do something about gun violence.
Mr. Spencer, is the Second Amendment Association doing any outreach to students?
I just barely couldn't hear you. I'm sorry.
Is the Second Amendment Association doing any outreach to students?
Absolutely. The youth is where things are important, but the first thing I would do is I would not educate students to march down Lincoln Boulevard against their own rights. I don't see what anything productive about that is. Against their own Second Amendment rights. They have the right to self-preservation. Even though they don't carry a gun, they still have stand your ground law that applies to them in a school should they be attacked. That they have the right to defend themselves. But as far as the concern, the cultural, and I'm very sympathetic to it, believe it or not. But for us growing up, it was the Russians were going to bomb us. It seems like there's something new each generation that comes along that we do have to adapt to and deal with. But in a country of liberty, there are concerns we have to deal with. I did answer your question, sir.
He has answered. Thank you. Mr. Spencer, I'd like to ask a question. A lot of the firearm deaths in Oklahoma are suicides. We have very high suicide rates, and most of those are committed with guns. So, red flag laws. There's the intent of those is to gun violence prevention laws, which would allow a family member to petition a court to take the gun away from someone who's threatening themselves or others. And in some cases, in states that have passed these laws, Connecticut, studies have found a decrease in suicides because of this. Connecticut, 1 suicide for every 10 to 12 gun seizures. Indiana, a 7.5% reduction over 10 years. What are your thoughts on these red flags?
As long as there's due process where the person that's being served has the opportunity to speak in front of a judge with representation, and if the judge says you need to have your weapons pulled from you, I'm not going to disagree with that. But they have to have due process.
Would you support those in your visits to legislators?
We would not get in the way of it, I'll put it that way.
Okay. Ms. Stone, I should mention that there are some countries like Japan that have high suicide rates and low gun ownership rates. So why would it necessarily work for suicides if we had red flag laws?
I think there's some cultural factors with Japan that we could talk about in a different discussion. I think we have to look at how these suicide rates have declined, and also homicide rates have declined too. These we call them extreme risk protective orders. You may hear that. And so I think that these laws allow family members to step in. We talk about being proactive. This is one way that we can be proactive. I'm heartened to hear Mr. Spencer say this is something that he can support. I think this is truly an area where we could craft a bill that we could all live with that would have public safety results while still preserving strong strong Second Amendment rights. One of the challenges with this has to do with this ex parte hearing, meaning that a gun could be taken away from someone before they had the opportunity to confront a judge. And I understand that that's a challenge for Second Amendment, extreme advocates or whatever you want to call yourselves. But I think that what we need to do is understand that there needs to be a time limit, 6 days, 3 days, 5 days. And there's lots of situations in our society where we take away people's rights to own a gun, like when they go to jail and they're held and they're getting bail. That happens regularly. We're really used to that. That's part of our culture, has been for a long time. And so I think that as we look at these extreme risk protective orders, it's no different than putting someone in jail and having them wait to get bail. And so these most of the time, these hearings happen at a very quick pace. The judge can either say, yes, this is fine, we're going to keep their guns for a year, and then they have the opportunity to have another hearing, get them back, or sell them to a licensed arms dealer.
Okay, thank you.
So that's the way that those could work.
Okay, House Bill 2457 by Representative Dunnington was introduced this year. It's a red flag bill. Page 12 of the bill specifically stated that they can come and take your guns and destroy them before you ever had the opportunity to see a judge. If you want to be serious about it, you can't bring garbage language like that in. It also said that the police could just keep the guns for whatever they thought was necessary with it in that same page on that same bill. So you're not going to be taken seriously if you're just doing something so absolutely abhorrent when you say we want common sense gun laws, but you're destroying a gun of a person that has not been convicted of a crime.
Yeah, I'm not
Okay, so
entirely
let's go
certain
on to
where
another
Mr.
question.
Dunnington got that
Thank
legislation.
you. We have a question up front here. Gentleman in the hat, I guess.
Nice hat.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Spencer. I moved here from Maryland a couple years ago. And I'm sorry about that. And Maryland has all these laws that Moms Demand Action want. They have red flag laws. They have may issue carry permits, waiting periods, assault weapons, and the list goes on and on. Yet in Maryland, in the city of Baltimore, which is similar size to the city of Oklahoma City, they have 300 homicides there, which is 4 times what we have in the city. They have more homicides in Baltimore City, Maryland, than the entire state of Oklahoma with 4 million people. It's a city of 600,000 people. Why should we believe that these laws are going to make us safer when we see the failures that I lived there for 50 years, I've seen the failures. I don't understand why we should believe these laws are going to make us safer.
Ms. Stone, what do you think?
I would say, number one, what would be the crime rate if they didn't have these laws?
Lower.
So you can't say that it would be lower.
Yes, I can. Washington, D.C., they instituted
Let her answer the
I'm
question
sorry.
first.
Okay.
What we see is that black market guns are way more expensive as we have these background check laws and it becomes harder to get laws. Additionally, what you see now in Baltimore is that 20% of the time that somebody, 2 out of every 10 guns are purchased without a background check, and that's federal, and Maryland doesn't do anything different in that regard. They do not have the same kind of background checks. You can still go onto arms list. You can also go to other states that are nearby and get guns. I don't know as much about Baltimore as you obviously do, but if we look at Chicago, which also is challenged with gun violence, what we see is the majority of guns that are seized in Chicago they were originally purchased elsewhere. So we have these problems of straw purchasers and all these issues. So I think that's why we need to look potentially at federal legislation to close loopholes to reduce gun violence. I think, Baltimore is a difficult city with a long history of gun violence, and, we can do some things, but obviously, unless we remove all guns from circulation, which I'm sensing might be an issue for some of you, we're probably not going to be able to reduce all gun violence.
Thank you. Mr. Spencer, did you want to add something?
Yes, Washington, D.C., when it was required to put in a concealed carry, the next year the crime had dropped 25% just because of the thought someone on the other side of the door may actually have a firearm. So it does work. The city of Chicago is its own worst enemy. I mean, that's 90 or 100 years of socialism at its best, and that's the response you got.
Well, I should mention that studies looking at the general nationwide decline in violent crime over 25 years have really not come up with an answer. They're like 10 or 12 answers, and they range from the abortion rate to technology to the introduction of Ritalin in schools. I mean, it just is all over the place. So I don't know of any research that has concluded that reduced availability of guns for more people has caused crime rates to go down. I have not seen any research, but I'm not an expert.
John Locke.
So, let's have another question on this side of the room. This gentleman here.
Thank you. There was really two questions, but I'm sure I only get to answer one, or ask one. I worked on campus for the Northeastern State Police Department, and when we talk about guns in schools, one of the main issues that the officers had with it is when there's a call that there is a active shooter on campus, their job is to go into the building and eliminate the threat. So when we introduce more guns in these environments, when officers get on the scene, they aren't sure which person is perpetuating the threat and which person is actually the threat. How do you find, or how do you assume, or how can you answer those concerns that the officers arriving on scene won't be able to know who is a part of the threat and who is actually a victim trying to
Good
stand
question.
up?
As we have seen, officers are usually come up and dealing with the situation that's already ended. So it's that, even though I agree 100% that could happen as a law-abiding gun owner, I realize and I accept that risk could be a part of my self-defense. But you cannot take that away from me just because I might be misunderstood, mistook for whatever reason in a self-defense action.
I'd like to go on to a question for both of you, and that is universal mandatory background checks. Mr. Spencer, why do many gun rights groups oppose in background checks, for private sellers at gun shows?
Because it's nobody else's business. It's not. That's right. If I want, that means if my kids want to inherit my firearms, that they would have to go through a universal background check to get my guns. If I want to sell a gun out here in the parking lot to you or to anybody, it's nobody else's business as long as I know you're not a felon. No, it doesn't. It shouldn't be changed at all.
Do you think there are increased risks though of allowing those sales without background?
Well,
checks?
I just know this: if someone wants to get a gun, they're going to do it, whether they steal it, buy it, or whatever they're going to do, they're going to get it. And so we have to be prepared to stop that individual when they try to do something crazy.
Ms. Stone, I'll ask you the same question, but also point out that there are the questions of the invasion of privacy, as he suggests, but aren't most guns used in crimes stolen or acquired legally? Aren't most sellers at gun shows federally licensed dealers? Are there proven incidents where someone bought the gun from a private seller at a gun show and then committed many crimes?
So part of the problem is that you don't necessarily know where someone got a gun if they haven't done any kind of, federally licensed firearm transaction. So what we know is that 2 out of 10 guns are bought in this country, and that doesn't include family transfers, and the current bill that is, in Congress right now particularly exempts family transfers. So 20% is stranger to stranger or buddy to buddy. So if you have somebody who is a felon, you're going to trust them to answer the question, are you a felon, honestly? I question that logic. If somebody has already demonstrated that they will commit a felony, they're going to say, yeah, to you. So I think that when we look at these kinds of transfers, there was an attorney who was a colleague's mom of mine. She had been in a marriage for 10 years. He had an alcohol problem. She was an attorney, so she did all the things she needed to do to be safe from him, protective order, etc. He wound up following her. They pulled off in a gas station parking lot, and he shot her. He had been required to give his gun to a friend, but he got another gun. And he got another gun because private sales are not legal. There are 1.5 million guns listed on armslist.com where any felon can go out and buy it. And a simple question, compared to a background check, just isn't enough protection, in my opinion.
Thank you. We'll take another question. I guess the gentleman there.
Thank you. Please direct my question to the OK2A president. You mentioned that a change in our culture has resulted in more violence. And it is, in my opinion, that in order to change the culture, we need to address mental health issues in our state. So, and those, it has been shown that if you address mental health, then suicides, the risk for suicide is reduced along with other violent crimes. So are you in favor of legislation that would increase funding for mental health services in Oklahoma?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
This gentleman in front.
Thank you. This is to the lady in red. My question will actually be a question. It'll be under 30 seconds. When you got all those statistics from states that enacted concealed carry permit laws and all the crime went skyrocketing, is there any record of how much of that crime was committed by people that had took the training required to get a concealed carry permit?
You know, when we get rid of the training requirements, it's really hard to tell if people took training or not. So, I mean, they at the point that the training is no longer required and officers are no longer asking for concealed carry permits, we lose all of that data. So I can't answer your question.
Okay. I'd like to interject one question. Mr. Spencer, assault weapons ban. We used to have one for 10 years. AR-15s were part of that. And also large capacity magazines were part of it, actually, a little known fact.
We call that a normal magazine, but go ahead.
Okay. Well, I think it was over 10 rounds at that time. What's your view now on restoring an assault weapons ban, specifically, of course, AR-15 or derivatives of the AR-15?
Well, I think just the hint of it was exactly what we saw during the previous president's administration, and you saw people acquiring them like crazy right and left. Yeah, ma'am, thank you very much. And so it will do nothing but make sales go completely through the roof. So anytime you tell anyone that they can't have something, what do? And you've already saw it happen with, like I said, the previous administration. So just the threat of another one, you'll see it continue on. You'll see people figure out how to make them. And also you can get the 80% lowers that are not marked. You can buy them all day long and they'll mail them right to your house. A person can machine them, mill them out themselves. So people will figure out a way to do it, whether they're good or bad. And it's terrible, the thought that you've got a bad person, or sorry, you've got a good person that's done nothing wrong, and all of a sudden they're bad just because of a law, not because of their actions.
Ms. Stone, what's your view on the assault weapons ban?
So I think you're right that there was a flurry of purchase whenever this was getting ready to go into effect. And so I think it took some time, and it perhaps didn't even fully go into effect, essentially, because there were so many AR-15s that were produced and available for sale. So I think letting that lapse really harmed public safety, because now we'll have that flurry all over again. But I think it's interesting, a Boston University study has said that large capacity magazines and the laws related to that are the best predictor of the mass shooting rate in a state. Meaning that if a state has limits on these types of high-capacity magazines, they are less likely to have mass shootings. There's also a lot of data that says that 86% of the fatalities in mass shootings have been because of AR-15s. The speed, the number of rounds make it very, very hard to get away from, and it makes it's an efficient killing machine. That's exactly what it is. And so allowing those in public control is certainly something that we need to look at. I know previously there's some challenges in identifying what exactly assault weapons are. And so groups like Moms Demand Action have not really prioritized that in their legislative advocacy, because there are other things like background checks that would save more lives.
Can a civilian purchase an assault weapon?
They can purchase an AR-15.
Okay, but that's not an assault weapon. Can they purchase an assault weapon?
The AR-15 was banned as part of the assault weapons ban.
But is it an assault weapon?
Well, I guess you can get over to the description.
We can talk about that some other time.
It was defined under the previous law very specifically.
So No, it's kind of nice to
And
know what
that's-
you're talking about before you
well,
say you're going to
that's-
start taking them away.
That's certainly part of the challenge in any kind of assault weapons ban is defining what is and what is not an assault weapon. And so I think that is one of the difficulties with that law and why people are looking at high-capacity magazines and certainly expanded background checks to save lives.
Do you understand why, and I've been asked this question before, I've been asked, why do you need an AR-15 magazine, or firearm with a 100-round magazine hooked up to a bump stock? I'm going to answer it for you. It's to keep those guys off my porch that want to come take it away.
If you're that bad
what
a
it's
shot,
for.
maybe you shouldn't have a gun anyway.
Okay.
You don't understand tyranny. The Second Amendment was designed to stop tyranny. That's what it's about, whether you like it or not.
Okay.
But again,
I would-
thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
I would love to answer that tyranny question.
Okay, we're going to take one more question from this side of the room. I guess the gentleman in the middle.
So this question's directed for the man in the red tie. What are the specific problems with the gun death statistics brought up earlier in the debate by Mrs. Stone in regards to permitless carry in St. Louis, Alaska, and Arizona? Also, how do you justify your self-reported...
I only do one question at a time.
Okay.
I'll
One
lose it.
question.
So just do one, if you would, sir.
All right. Well, so how do you, like, what is your specific issue with those, statistics in relation to those states and St. Louis in regards to permitless carry?
Man, I am just not understanding the question for sure.
Well, I don't know if he'll know enough specifically
You said they were
about those
Bloomberg
statistics.
statistics, is what you said. I think the question relates to why you're not accepting data from state and local police officials.
Because last year it was real popular. They said there was over 300 school shootings when it turned out they were counting a person that committed suicide. They were counting an accidental discharge by a resource officer. They were counting all these things that had nothing to do with a crazy going into a school to shoot.
No,
That's
those
why-
statistics were particular to the charge of assault with a gun.
Okay. I'm going to give our guests...
300 school shootings last year?
Thank you. I want to give our guests one last chance. Mr. Spencer,
Yes, sir.
You make your final case here for what you want most of all in terms of gun restrictions or gun rights. You could take in doing about 60 seconds.
We want a safer society, so we need to make sure our rights are returned that should have never been taken away. It's simple. And for those of you that have served in the armed forces and know that how important it is to have a firearm, and that you've been in places where they needed them for self-defense, and we've seen countries like Venezuela and South America where they've taken guns away and they have the terrible, most highest crime rates in the world that are taking place so bad people are trying to pour into our country to get away from it. If you don't want that here, you got to be able to defend yourself and anyone, and you don't have to. That's a great thing about this country. If you don't want a firearm, you don't have to take it up. You don't have to do anything. It's not mandatory. But again, it is a right. It is a right just like any of the other rights, and it has to be protected, and it's the Second Amendment that defends all of the other rights.
Thank you. Ms. Stone, same question for you.
I would argue that it is the freedom of speech that defends all other rights. And as we looked at the Arab Spring, it was freedom of speech and not guns that brought democracy to those places. So there are a few things that I would like to see happen. And the thing is that if these happen, the people in this room would not lose their Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. Things like universal background checks, protecting kids and families from guns through the use of extreme risk protective orders, and disarming domestic abusers. So as long as your family thinks that you should have a gun and you're not domestically abusing anyone and you aren't a felon, you can keep your guns. And that's what Moms Demand Action is advocating. And also, almost 90% of people across the country agree with these statistics and these positions. And so these are not extreme ideas. These are common sense ideas that can save lives. We don't need people that have particular hobbies to overwhelm the rights of everyone else. And so I would encourage you to take a look at the research that I've shared today. It's not fake news. It's all out there. And let's make evidence-based decisions about things that really matter.
Thank you. Let's give our guests let's give both our panelists a round of applause for taking the time to answer the questions